Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Dr. Kroenig. Welcome to the Asia Initiative Lecture Series. My name is Amanda Wan, and I'm the founder and coordinator of the Asia Initiative Lecture Series at the Institute of War Politics. For those who are new to the Institute of War Politics, IWP is a graduate school of statecraft, national security, international affairs, and intelligence. We have a doctoral program as well as 5 master's programs and 18 certificates of graduate study and a continuing education program. The objective of this lecture series is to broaden the scope and discussion on a range of intelligence, foreign policy, and security issues attendant to the Asian geopolitical, socioeconomic, and cultural spheres of influence. Today we have Dr. Matthew Kroenig, who will be presenting a lecture on his book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry. Dr. Kroenig is the Deputy Director of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council and the Director of the Center's Global Strategy Initiative. He's also a tenured professor of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. A 2019 study in Perspectives on Politics ranked him one of the top 25 most cited political scientists of his generation. He's the author or editor of 7 books, including The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the U.S. and China, and The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy. Dr. Kroenig, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Amanda. Thank you very much for the Institute of World Politics for hosting tonight's event, and thanks to all of you for tuning in. So as was mentioned, I'm here to talk about my new book, The Return of Great Power Rivalry, Democracy versus Autocracy from the Ancient World to the U.S. and China. And as many of you know, the return of great power rivalry, return of great power competition was called out in the 2017 National Security Strategy of the United States as the greatest threat to the national security and economic well-being of the United States and its allies. And there's something of a conventional wisdom going around Washington, at least, that maybe the United States is in trouble in this competition, that our democracy is weak, fragmented, polarized, and Russia and China have these efficient autocratic systems. They can make big strategic decisions, plan for the long term, and that maybe the United States needs to accommodate itself to not being the world's leading power, living in a more multipolar world, perhaps over time even living in a Chinese-led international system. So I was skeptical of these claims. It's one of the things that motivated me to write this book. And indeed, in this book, I come to a different conclusion, that democracies have excelled in great power competition for the past 2,500 years, and that the United States and its allies are actually well-positioned to maintain their international leadership role. So that's what I want to talk about over the next 40 minutes or so, and then very much look forward to Q&A and discussion. So if I can, I'd like to share some slides to guide us through the discussion. Hope you can all see that. There's the cover of the book. And, you know, one of the key kind of policy questions is, will the United States retain its position as the leading state in the world? The United States has been the most powerful country on earth, according to most measures, since World War II. And this really raises a bigger question, which is, what do we know about why major powers like the United States are able to maintain their position atop the international system? And what do we know about why they decline, why they're overtaken by other challengers? And again, just to preview where we're going, I argue that the answer is that democracies are better able to amass power and wealth in the international system, more likely to become major powers, more likely to become the leading state in the system, less likely to be dislodged once they do become the leading state. And if that's correct, then again, we can expect that the United States will retain its leadership position for the foreseeable future. So the return of great power rivalry, and you are all probably familiar with this story, but you know, great power competition has been a part of international politics since the beginning of recorded human history, going all the way back to the Greeks and the Persians, all the way through the Cold War. But we did have this remarkable 25-year period after the end of the Cold War and until 2014 or so, where we essentially had the absence of great power competition. And it's really hard to imagine now, if you look back to the 2010 national security strategy of President Obama, Never once does that strategy mention Russia or China as possible threats. It only mentions them as possible partners for cooperation on things like arms control, non-proliferation, climate change. But the world has changed quite a bit in the past 11 years. Beginning with Russia, in 2014, we saw Russia invade Ukraine, make threats, including nuclear threats, against the rest of NATO and the United States. It intervened militarily in Syria, reestablishing itself as a power broker in the Middle East for the first time since the 1970s. And it's used information, disinformation, election interference, and other propaganda techniques to weaken and undermine NATO and Western democracies. And so some people fear that Russia is dead set on disrupting the U.S.-led international order that we've essentially lived in since 1945. The even bigger threat comes from China. And at about the same time period, well, really over the past several decades, China has had enormous economic growth. It currently has the second largest economy on earth after the United States. And many economists predict that it could overtake the United States as the world's leading economy within the next decade or so. It's been investing those economic gains into military hardware, shifting the balance of power in East Asia. And now many U.S. defense planners wonder, can the United States still defend Taiwan in a major conflict with China? China is using that military power to take contested territory in the South China Sea. And you can see an image here of its island building campaign in the South China Sea. And it's also using its economic might to increase its diplomatic heft around the world with One Belt, One Road initiative and other tools. And the Belt and Road initiative is ostensibly a kind of a plan to resurrect old Silk Road trading routes through infrastructure investment in Eurasia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere. But really, it's kind of a Chinese grand plan to increase its geopolitical influence in every region of the world. And so if people fear that Russia is trying to disrupt the US-led system, that they also fear that China is really seeking to displace it, to set up a Chinese-centric world order. So will they succeed? And as was mentioned before, I think some think that they will succeed, that we don't have our own house in order, and that these autocratic powers are efficient and ruthless competitors. So is that the case? And just to say that, we were a little bit slow to awaken to this challenge, but by 2017 in the National Security Strategy, 2018 in the National Defense Strategy, the U.S. government did say this is the top priority. Don't know if you saw, but just today, the Biden administration released some interim strategic guidance, a kind of mini national security strategy. And in there, they also say that the greatest state-based threat to the United States comes from China. So this isn't just Trump. There's a bipartisan consensus that this is the biggest challenge, state-based challenge facing the country. So what do we know about whether democracies or autocracies do better in great power competition? This is kind of the requisite slide in an academic presentation to say there's been a lot of related literature, but nothing really on this question. Believe it or not, whether democracies or autocracies are better able to dominate the world hasn't been a major source of recent social science research. It is a question, though, that older political theorists were interested in, of earlier generations. So Polybius, Montesquieu, Machiavelli all wrote about the advantage of democratic, or as they called them, republican forms of government. And Machiavelli may be the one, if you know Machiavelli, that is surprising to some people. And Machiavelli is probably best known for really his handbook for dictators, The Prince, where he recommends any means, no matter how ruthless, for a prince to rule in a turbulent and violent era. But I know Machiavelli pretty well. One of my hardship posts at Georgetown is I teach a 2-week course in Florence, Italy, every summer on Machiavelli. And Machiavelli wrote another book, Discourses on Livy, which I think is his greater work. And in the Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli basically gives a full-throated defense of republican forms of government. And he was fascinated by ancient Rome and the question of how did Rome rise from being a small city-state on the Tiber River to dominating the entire Mediterranean basin. And essentially, he argues that the answer is Rome's republican form of government. that Republican institutions are better able to harness the energies of a population towards state expansion. And Polybius and Montesquieu make similar arguments about the rise of Rome. And so this is, new to some people. I think we often think of Rome as this dominant empire led by the Caesars, but by the emperors. But Machiavelli and others have pointed out that really its greatest expansion of power came under the Republic, and then it was after the transition to empire that Rome began its decline. So while scholars recently haven't thought about how what gives rise to international dominance, I decided I would try to update some of these arguments for a new era and take a step back and say, okay, what allows a country to become a major power? What allows it to become the leading state in the international system? And just make some common sense assumptions. In order for a country to be strong internationally, it has to have a strong economy, strong diplomacy, and a strong military. Strong economy might make sense. If you have a large economy, you can use that economic power to promise trade and investment to your friends. You can also threaten to hurt your enemies, cut off trade, cut off investments with sanctions, tariffs, or other tools. Having a large economy is also important because it allows you to invest in military power, what may be the most important resource in an anarchic international system. If you have a strong military, you can promise to protect your friends, but again, you can threaten to hurt your enemies. And then having strong diplomacy is an important part of international leadership as well. Most things are easier if you have a lot of friends and allies and partners, and international politics is no different. And moreover, if the rest of the world is ganging up on you, standing in your way, forming counterbalancing coalitions against you, hard to achieve what you want to achieve in international politics. Just look at Napoleon and Hitler for examples of that. So in short, you have to be strong economically, diplomatically, and militarily. Are democracies or autocracies better able to do this? So one of the other things I do at Georgetown is I teach a PhD seminar on advanced international relations theory. And this course focuses on social science research done in the past 20 years or so. And while social scientists haven't theorized the sources of global dominance directly, they have really been obsessed with this question of, are democracies different? Do democracies behave differently when it comes to narrower outcomes economically, diplomatically, and militarily? And essentially the finding has been that yes, democracies are different, and they seem to be at least a little bit better than autocracies in a number of areas. And so really in this book, I have the advantage of standing on the shoulders of giants and aggregating up a lot of these smaller findings into a bigger argument about the fitness of democracies in international politics. So what are some of these democratic advantages? And just go through quickly. But first, social scientists and economists have identified a number of economic advantages. So Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson are two political economists who've argued that democracies tend to have higher long-run rates of economic growth. They tend to put in place better economic institutions, things like protections on property rights, courts that can actually enforce business contracts. Basically, they just set the rules of the game so that people have an incentive to participate in economic activity. On the other hand, they say that autocracies don't tend to put in place good economic institutions. They tend to put in place institutions that benefit the dictator or people around him and her, but not a broad cross-section of society. And so if those are the rules of the game, why invest in a business if the government might seize it from you? Why invest in economic activity if courts are too corrupt to enforce your contracts? So they essentially argue that autocracies don't put in place the incentives that encourage long-run growth. They also argue that democracies are better at innovation. They encourage human capital, thinking outside the box, risk-taking entrepreneurship that leads to the major breakthroughs. But thinking outside the box, risk-taking is discouraged in autocracies. It's a good way to land yourself in trouble with the authorities. And so, again, these kind of systems don't often encourage breakthrough innovations. Also, a lot of political economy research about how democracies are more open to international trade, according to almost any measure. Higher proportion of their GDP come from imports and exports, more trade agreements, fewer tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And we've known since the time of Adam Smith and David Ricardo that there are advantages to the specialization that comes from international trade, advantages that democracies are better positioned to take care of. Basically, democracies are just more comfortable with goods, services, people, ideas flowing across their borders. Autocrats like control, including controlling what's coming across their borders. So they tend to put in place higher tariffs and barriers to trade and investment. This democratic advantage also extends to international finance. And I would just ask those of you listening, how many of you have retirement accounts? And how many of you are investing in the United States? And how many of you are investing in Russia and China? And I'm guessing I know the answer. You probably have a lot of money in the S&P 500 and U.S. Treasury bonds. Probably don't have much in Russia and China. And the same is true for Russians and Chinese. Wealthy Russians and Chinese are buying property in the United States, trying to get the wealth out of that country. Same is true of the Chinese government. What do they do with the wealth they're getting from international trade? Well, they're buying U.S. Treasury bonds. They think putting their wealth in the U.S. government is the safest investment on earth. So basically, investors trust democracies with their wealth, and they don't trust autocracies. And so if you look through history, the centers of international finance have always been in more open republican systems, starting with the ancient Venetian Republic during the Italian Renaissance, which was arguably the first kind of global capital of capital, all the way to Wall Street and the city of London today. So in short, some serious economic advantages: higher long-run rates of growth, more innovative, more trade, and better financial systems. What about diplomacy? Let me say one thing about economics, because we'll come back to this later. Well, people might be saying, well, what about China? Isn't this an exception? And what Robinson, Acemoglu, and others have argued is that, no, it's not really an exception, that autocracies, through state planning, have shown themselves to be pretty good at reallocating resources from unproductive areas to more productive areas for short periods of time, getting short bursts of growth. But then once those advantages have been realized, then the state has to make the next bet. And that historically, state-led planning has been poor at making those bets, not as good as market economies. And so Robinson and Acemoglu, among others, think the Chinese economic model is running out of steam. What about diplomatically? A political science research that shows that democracies are better able to build alliances. And just think about the NATO alliance compared to, any of Russia's alliances, really. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, its alliance with China, the Warsaw Pact. NATO has been long-lasting, a large alliance, over 30 members. When the United States was attacked on 9/11, countries actually came to each other's defense. That's not the way autocracies work in alliances. They're not good at building alliances. So I mentioned Russia. It signed an alliance with Nazi Germany during World War II, and then they fought a war against each other. Signed an alliance with the Warsaw Pact countries, and then it invaded two of its Warsaw Pact members, Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Signed an alliance with China, nearly fought a nuclear war with China. After the end of the Cold War, set up the Commonwealth of Independent States. And then it invaded two of the members of the Commonwealth of Independent States, Georgia and Ukraine. So when a democratic ally says, we're allies, you can rest assured for the most part that they'll have your back. When autocracies say the same things, you better watch your back. And this is true not just of alliances, but international commitments more broadly. Political scientists have very few firm laws. But one of them is that we know that democracies are more likely to sign and keep international commitments of all types: trade agreements, human rights agreements, security agreements. Nuclear non-proliferation treaty is one I know pretty well. I have a background in nuclear strategy. 9 times countries have signed the NPT and cheated and tried to build secret nuclear weapons programs. All 9 times they were autocracies. Iran, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. Never once has a democracy signed the NPT and cheated. Democracies also have more soft power, a term coined by professor at Harvard, Joe Nye, that basically means you're attractive to other countries, you have an attractive culture, policies. The University of Southern California keeps a ranking, the Soft Power 30. Of the 30 countries in the world with the most soft power, according to USC, the top 20 are all democracies. Russia and China make the list, but they're near the bottom, 27 and 30. I think the United States is currently at number 4. It wasn't number 1 under Obama. It slipped to number 4 under Trump. We'll see. I suspect it will climb back up those rankings. And an argument I make here that I haven't seen before, but it's something I came out in doing the research for this book, is that it seems like democracies are able to amass wealth and power and other countries don't get nervous. But the same is not true of autocracies. When autocracies start to accrue power, other countries start to get nervous. They start to balance against them. And I think we've seen that from Xerxes to Napoleon to Hitler, and I think we're seeing it with the Chinese Communist Party today. Finally, what are the military advantages that democracies have? Again, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, but political scientists have looked at which countries have won the wars they've fought from 1815 to the present, and they found that democracies empirically are more likely to win their wars. Democracies have won something like 75% of the wars they've fought since 1815. The corresponding number for autocracies is only about 48%. Why is that the case? Two possible explanations. One is that democratic leaders make better decisions. Not that they don't make mistakes, but that they are less likely to make big mistakes. Because they live in open societies, they're more likely to hear criticism from within their own governments, from other branches of government, from the media. So when leaders make big decisions about war and peace, they have a fairly good sense of what the cost and benefits are. On the other hand, in a dictatorship, dictators surround themselves with yes men and women who tell them what they want to hear. And it wasn't uncommon for Saddam Hussein to literally shoot people in the head who gave him bad news. And so that happens once or twice, and you don't hear bad news anymore. The dictator says, I want to invade Russia in the winter, and the people around him or her says, great idea, boss. They also think that democratic soldiers might make more effective soldiers on the battlefield, that they're more willing to take initiative. No plan survives first contact with the enemy, so can your officers adapt on the battlefield? They argue democratic soldiers can do that. For autocratic soldiers, it's too dangerous. You don't want to be insubordinate. Much safer to just stay put and wait for orders from above than to take initiative. If I argue in this book that if democracies are more innovative in general, they may be more innovative when it comes to warfare, and I think I found quite a bit of evidence for that. And then finally, perhaps the greatest strength democracies have is they don't have to spend enormous resources repressing their own people. And throughout history, we've seen that the greatest threat to dictators is their own people, not the foreign enemy. And that's true today. The Russians and the Chinese spend more on internal security than they do on their own militaries. For the United States, it's 2-to-1 in the other direction. So you add all this up, and this is a pretty serious set of advantages for democracies. They have economic, diplomatic, and military strengths. So this is kind of a schematic of the argument. And, often in the United States, we debate what is our greatest strength? Is it our power-projecting global superpower military? Is it our dynamic economy? Is it Silicon Valley and Wall Street? Or is it, you often hear it said that it's our alliances. It's our network of friends and allies around the world. My argument in the book essentially is that really our greatest strength is our domestic political institutions. And those other things are reflections of our institutions. We have a strong economy, we have strong diplomacy, and we have a strong military because of our Republican form of government, Republican with a small r. Now, there's been counterarguments over the years. Plato argued that a philosopher king would be the best ruler. Alexander de Tocqueville was a big fan of democracy in America, but he thought that the United States would never be able to do foreign policy. He thought that foreign policy required secrecy, ruthlessness, and that dictators are just better at that. And Henry Kissinger, during the Cold War, sometimes wondered whether the Soviet Union would be more efficient and ruthless a competitor than the United States. And we're hearing a version of this autocratic advantage argument today. At least I often hear it in Washington. So they say autocracies like President Xi and the Chinese Communist Party can make big, bold decisions. They can invest in green technology. They can invest in infrastructure. Meanwhile, in the United States, we're gridlocked, we're dysfunctional, we can't get anything done. New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman had a column a few years ago called China for a Day, where he basically made this point. And he said, wouldn't it be great if we could be China for a day? We could pull a lever and get things done, make investments in climate change. But instead, poor us, we're gridlocked, we can't get anything done. A second argument you hear is that autocracies are good at long-run planning, that in democracies, we're focused on the next election 2-4 years away. Meanwhile, Russia, China, they have plans for 2035, plans for 2049. They play Go and chess, and we play checkers. They're just better strategists. The other argument you hear is the de Tocqueville argument. Democracies were too weak, were constrained by laws and norms. And autocracies can really take the gloves off in a dangerous international system. They can lie, cheat, steal, assassinate. And it might be ugly, but they get things done. And then finally, they argue that autocratic politics are, at least to the outside world, they seem stable, clean, efficient. President Xi seems firmly in control. Meanwhile, we've got impeachment hearings and scandals playing out, on a frequent basis. So I argue in the book that these arguments essentially are wrong, or that there are strong counterarguments to each of them. So a big, bold decision is great so long as it's the right one. If it's the wrong one, it means big, bold mistakes. Again, like invading Russia in the winter. So the fact that we're polarized, the flip side of that is it means we don't make big mistakes. Second, it's not true that autocracies are better at long-run planning. In fact, it's the opposite. Since dictators are unconstrained, they can bounce around from one failed policy to another. And I think we've seen that quite a bit in China with Mao Zedong and all the way up to President Xi. Meanwhile, I think democracies are actually more stable at charting a long-run strategic course. And I argue in the book, essentially, that the United States has had the same strategic plan since 1945, a plan to build, revitalize, adapt, and defend this U.S.-led, rules-based international system. So that's a much more impressive strategic plan than China's Belt and Road Initiative or its Made in China 2035 initiative, these plans that have been around for a few years that many in the West see as evidence of China's long-run strategic planning genius. Being unconstrained has its advantages. It has its disadvantages as well. Having a reputation for utter ruthlessness has downsides. We don't trust Russia when it says it's going to abide by arms control treaties. We don't trust Russia when it says it's going to abide by ceasefires in Ukraine. And so we don't trust Russia when it says it has a COVID-19 vaccine. Even when it is now coming out to some scientists saying it's effective. So there's a downside to another utter lack of credibility in international politics. And the idea that autocratic politics are clean and efficient, that's only the image. There's plenty of politicking going on. It's just happening in backroom torture chambers. The advantage of democracies is we let our differences and our political fights, we're transparent. We let this play out in public on CNN. Final possibility, maybe there's no difference. And realist international relations scholars have said, it's a dangerous world. If one of these systems was better than the other, then in a kind of Darwinian struggle of survival, one of them would have been eliminated and we'd only have one kind of government in the world. So we have three possibilities. Maybe democracies are better. Maybe autocracies are better. Maybe neither is better. So the next step then is turn to the evidence and see what we can find. And some political scientists have talked about long cycle theories of international relations, basically the rise and fall of great powers over time. And one of the leading studies conducted in 1985 by Rasler and Thompson basically says that the leading state in the international system since 1609 has been a republic among the most democratic countries on earth at the time. They say first the Dutch Republic, then Great Britain, and since then the United States. Their study ended in 1985, but their students have updated it to the present. So this is pretty impressive, an undefeated record for 4 centuries and counting. And what's remarkable to me is if you go back, even further, how rare democracies are, but how often they end up coming out on top. We often forget, but until World War II, there were only about a dozen democracies on Earth. Yet if you look over the past 2,500 years of world history, ancient Athens, the Roman Republic, the Venetian Republic, the Dutch Republic, Great Britain, the United States, it always seems like there's a democracy at or near the top of the global pecking order, even though these are pretty rare forms of government. Now, I also do some statistical analysis, and for those of you who know political science, it's becoming more like economics in some ways, more like medicine, trying to quantify and measure outcomes. And so political scientists have measures for how powerful a country is, and they have measures for how democratic a country is. And so I just took these two off-the-shelf measures and looked for some correlations and found consistent with this idea that democracies do seem to hold more power in the world. So the first test I've said is, okay, for all democracies in the world from 1815 to 2010, how many of them possessed at least 1% of global power as measured by political scientists? 28% of democracies met that threshold, only 20% of autocracies. So statistically significant difference. I asked how many made it to the ranks of the major powers. Among all democracies, 16% became major powers, only 7% of autocracies. And then same question for the leading power. Which country had the most power on earth? And in the years from 1815 to 2010, a democracy occupied that top spot in 84% of the years, with the Soviet Union and China breaking in a few years because of the way power is counted. So some compelling evidence overall that democracies seem to amass more power. But what might be most interesting to most people are some of the case studies. So I do 7 cases of autocratic versus democratic rivalries, starting 2,500 years ago with the Greeks and the Persians, and coming all the way up to the end of the Cold War. Now, obviously, in a short lecture today, I don't have time to go through all of these. If you're interested, go to the book. But it was quite interesting to me that these more democratic countries did pretty well in the rivalries with autocracies, and for the precise reasons identified in the theoretical framework. They tended to become trading powers, have innovative economies, become centers of global finance, build strong alliances, have powerful militaries, often powerful navies. On the other hand, autocracies tended to do pretty poorly. They did well for a while, but they often imploded, again, for a lot of the same reasons identified in this theoretical framework. Their economic growth models slowed, they had financial troubles, the rest of the world ganged up against them in counterbalancing coalitions, and they had military troubles. Either they started and lost disastrous military wars, or they had domestic insurrections that led to regime collapse. And so really this study gave me a new appreciation of Western civilization. I really do think of world history now as the kind of passing of the torch of these democratic superpowers from Athens to Rome to Venice to Amsterdam to London, and then on to its current resting place in Washington, D.C. So again, can't go through all of the cases, but just point out a few highlights. Again, the Roman Republic, it was really under the Republic, not under the Empire, that you see this huge explosion in wealth and power. The Venetian Republic is interesting. I'd always thought of Venice as kind of a quaint tourist destination, but in the 1200s, it was a superpower, probably the wealthiest city on earth, the largest navy on earth, the center of global finance, and was really more of a city empire, controlled territory throughout the Middle East and into the Black Sea as far away as Russia. Dutch Republic, a remarkable story. If you don't know about it, I encourage you to read about it. Essentially, I think Great Britain and then the United States followed the Dutch Republic's model for being a democratic superpower. Center of global finance, powerful navy, powerful trading country, innovative militarily. And we're more familiar with England and the United States. But getting to what's most interesting to most people, what does this mean for the current era of great power competition among the US, Russia, and China? Well, Russia is kind of an easy case for the argument. It's a prototypical example of a weak autocracy. And indeed, there's even a question about whether Russia belongs in a discussion of great powers. Its economy is in pretty poor shape. It's smaller than Italy's and Spain's. We don't consider Italy or Spain great powers, nor should we. So economically, Russia is not a great power. Diplomatically, it's not a great power either. It doesn't have allies and friends, as we've discussed. It's been better at interfering in America's alliances, and that's worrisome, but Russia is not very good at building its own partnerships. Militarily is an area where Russia has punched above its weight, and I do worry about the Russian military threat to NATO. But there are real limits as to what Russia is going to be able to do because of its economic weakness. And indeed, we've seen Russian military spending decline in each of the past several years. So Russia can disrupt the US-led system, but not in a position to really be a challenger, a peer challenger to the United States. Now, what about China? And this may be the hard case for the book. When I first started researching the book, people said, you're crazy. China's a juggernaut. It's not going to slow down anytime soon. And indeed, we have seen China's economy grow, gaining influence, investing in military power. But I think we're also now seeing the cracks in the system. Dictators economically have always preferred control over performance. And we're seeing that quite clearly with Xi today. He's prioritizing his control over the Chinese economy over performance. He's renationalizing major parts of the Chinese economy, backtracking on promised liberalizing market reforms, and the Chinese economy is suffering because of it. So economists say that China will overtake the United States in 10 years. What many forget is that 10 years ago in 2010, economists were saying that China would overtake the United States in 2020. Okay, here we are in 2021. The US still has a healthy lead. Now economists are saying 2030. I suspect in 2030, they'll be saying 2040. And I suspect the real answer is never, that China will never overtake the United States as the world's leading economy. Diplomatically, we're seeing the kind of backlash we've seen against other dictators in the past. Piece of evidence number one on this is the United States. After decades of trying to cooperate with China, has declared China public enemy number one. Other evidence abounds. The Quad forming in Asia, Japan, India, Australia, and the United States forming this proto-alliance against China. Europe declaring China a systemic rival. I think we're seeing the rest of the world beginning to turn on China in the same way we've seen it turn on other powerful dictators in the past. And militarily, China, I think, has real problems with military innovation. Just to take one example I know well, nuclear weapons. In the West, we take it for granted that if a country wants a nuclear deterrent, it puts nuclear weapons on submarines, it sends them to sea, and it has this kind of survivable nuclear second strike capability. China wanted to do that. It put its first submarine in the water in 1986. And here we are decades later, and China still doesn't do regular deterrence patrols. So this is a 1960s technology for the United States that China still can't figure out. And part of the reason for that is it simply doesn't trust its military officers to go to sea with nuclear weapons. It likes to keep centralized control of its nuclear weapons. But the biggest military challenge that China faces is it doesn't, it's afraid of its own people. And again, it's spending more on domestic security than on the PLA. If you follow the money, China is more afraid of Uyghurs and protesters in Hong Kong than it is of the US Department of Defense. So these are some pretty serious competitive weaknesses. So here's an example of one of China's Belt and Road investments. Here's the data on China backtracking on promised economic reforms under President Xi, hurting the economy. Here's this Chinese nuclear submarine that just sits at port, doesn't go to sea. Here's the biggest security threat to the CCP, not the Pentagon, but internal threats. And now let's come to the United States. And not to be Pollyannish, we have our problems. We've all seen the problems, including on January 6th. But we often overlook our strengths. And the United States remains the world's largest economy, remains the center of global finance, has been the world's innovation leader since the time of Thomas Edison. Diplomatically, the United States has over 30 formal treaty allies, the 29 other members of NATO, Japan, Australia, Korea, and others. If it's just the United States against China, it's roughly 25% of global GDP to 16% of global GDP, getting a little bit too close for comfort. If you throw in America's allies, though, we're almost 2/3 of global GDP. So a significant preponderance of power still over China. And still retain the world's only superpower military. In fact, we forget this, but when we talk about the United States potentially losing a war to Russia and China, essentially what we mean is that Russia or China might attack a small, weak U.S. ally in their own backyard, and the United States would have a difficult war. And that's true, but these aren't symmetrical situations. We're not worried about Russia or China projecting power into North America, fighting the United States on its own territory. So still a serious military challenge that we need to worry about, but neither of these countries are peer competitors. On just some of the data, U.S. still with a commanding lead and share of GDP. Other measures of wealth, actually, the United States' gain over China is growing. Still the innovation leader. Militarily, spending many times more on its military than China and several other countries combined. So to wrap up, what does this mean for how we think about international relations? Well, I think what it means for international relations theory is that often we think about democracy as being a good thing because it protects freedom and human rights, and that's true. But really, this book makes the hard power case for democracy. That democracy is the best machine ever invented for generating enormous wealth and power on the world stage. And what does it mean for U.S. foreign policy? Well, I think a number of things. First, it means that the United States, despite our problems, is well positioned to be the world's most powerful country for the foreseeable future. Second, this doesn't mean that there's nothing to worry about. I do think that Russia and China pose serious threats. And so the United States and its allies do need to defend against the threats that come from these second-rate powers, but still serious threats. Democracies beat Hitler in the end, but we had to fight a world war to do it, and I think that is a possibility this time as well. Third, if our greatest strength is our institutions, then we do need to get our own house in order, and I do worry about American democracy. And so I think focusing at home so we can lead abroad is important. Fourth, contrary to this idea that we can't do strategic planning, I think we've done it quite well for the past 75 years. This rules-based international system has been the best grand strategy ever invented. But it's not 1945, it's not 1991 anymore, so we can't stick to an old strategy. We need to revitalize and adapt it for a new era. And if we want to get tougher with Russia and China, often in the national security community, we think about where are we weak and where is the enemy strong. And that makes sense. We worry about our vulnerabilities. But I often think good strategy comes about from doing the opposite. Where are we strong? Where are they weak? And how can we stick it to them there? And this book does identify our strengths and their weaknesses for a more competitive approach. And then finally, just to wrap up, we worry about our hard policy problems with good reason. But I would say that the harder problem really rests in Beijing and Moscow, and that President Putin and President Xi have a choice. If they want to cling to power, as it seems that they want to do, then that's fine, but they're going to be destined to rule over dysfunctional second-rate powers. Or if they truly want to be world leaders, as they say, then the answer is obvious. They need to give up power, put in place the kind of democratic system that we've seen has been a prerequisite for international leadership for the past 2,500 years. So I'll end my remarks there and very much look forward to the Q&A and discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kroenig, for a very insightful lecture, and we'll take questions now. So the first question is actually from an IWP professor. During the Cold War, then Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger warned against the 10-foot-tall syndrome, that is, viewing the Soviet Union as towering figures with overwhelming strength, intellect, and capabilities. Do you think we are perhaps falling into the same dilemma as regards China?
Good question, and that is a great quote. I should have used it in the book, but I didn't. And yes, I do think we're falling into the same trap, that we see China as this unstoppable economy that will become the world's leading economy, that's gaining ground diplomatically and even in our own backyard of Europe and the Americas, that's militarily, as the National Defense Strategy Commission report said, may be able to defeat us in next major war. And so I think we are right to worry about these challenges. But we need to have a balanced assessment. China has some real problems economically, diplomatically, and militarily. If we want a good competitive strategy, we need to recognize those weaknesses and exploit those weaknesses. So yes, I think we're falling into the same trap. We need to have a little bit of strategic confidence. We have enormous strengths. And in the book, I ask the reader, whose hand would you rather play? If you had to play great power competition. In short, yes, I think that's a danger. We need a balanced assessment.
Thank you. And we actually have the second question. So from the same professor, how would you assess President Biden's recent statement after his lengthy phone call with President Xi that, in essence, he would not pressure China over their internal policies, specifically mentioning the Uyghurs and the protesters in Hong Kong?
Well, maybe I didn't see the readout of that call, and I should go look at that. If he did say that, I think that's the wrong approach. 'Cause I think what's happening internally in China is a humanitarian tragedy, the genocide, obviously, in Xinjiang. Not only that, I think it shows that China does see this as a vulnerability. And so 2 points here. I think this is an opportunity for the United States. And it's not just the United States that's worried about this. European allies, other democracies are worried about this. And so if we want to rally coalitions against China, I think this is an important issue. The Europeans don't feel the military threat as much, but many European officials I talk to are very much concerned about what's going on in Xinjiang. And so we can, not only should we address it in its own right, but I think it's an advantage for us in building alliances. And then also, this is where China is vulnerable. They're worried about their internal security. China has no reservations about interfering in our domestic politics. Russia has no reservations about that. We've seen it with election interference. And so I think we should consider fighting fire with fire. Do we tell Cyber Command to conduct cyber attacks to take down the Great Firewall? Do we tell them to send text messages to every Chinese citizen about some of the corruption and things that President Xi are doing? This is where China is vulnerable. And if we're willing to intervene in their domestic affairs like they are in ours, then they're going to be quite vulnerable to that.
Thank you, Dr. Kroenig. The next question is, do you think China should be considered to pose a threat to the U.S.?
I would say yes. And we see that in a number of different ways. Economically, it is engaging in intellectual property theft, unfair trade practices, and so we want to address those. When it comes to democracy and human rights, it's engaging in the gross human rights abuses I discussed, but also exporting authoritarianism in various ways. By example, like exporting facial recognition technology to other dictators. And then militarily, it's increasingly posing a threat to our allies and partners in Asia. So it is a serious threat. I'm not saying we shouldn't worry about it. I'm just saying we should put it in perspective. We're stronger than many people appreciate. China's weaker, I think, than many people appreciate, and we're well positioned to prevail in this competition.
Thank you. And the next question is, ability to adapt to changing circumstances is key over long timelines. In a word, resilience. Please comment on rigidity versus resilience as critical, and how does this fit with your argument?
It's a good point. I think this is one of democracy's advantages. We are more resilient and adaptable. We have enormous capacity for self-renewal. Yes, we have challenges, but we recognize them and we try to address them. And I think we've seen that. Autocracies, I think, have a harder time with that kind of adjustment. They're not as reflective about, they often, just one example, autocracies often lie to themselves because, if you're a provincial governor in China and the central party in Beijing says your goal is to have 10% growth this year, what do you report? You report that you have 10% growth, even if it's not true. Whereas I think democracies sometimes are overly critical about our weaknesses, but it means we're aware of them. And we try to address them. So yes, this is another one of our strengths, and I think on balance, one of their weaknesses.
Thank you. And this question is from an IWP doctoral student. What are the critical vulnerabilities of democracies in your view? We have observed China and Russia's subversive attacks on the legitimacy of our democratic institutions.
Yeah, good question. So I wouldn't want to present this as democracies are all sunshine and autocracies, all weaknesses. Democracies have our weaknesses too, of course. And autocracies do have strengths. And so one of the weaknesses since time immemorial, I think, is that democracies are more open to outside penetration. And so I talk about this at the mountain pass at Thermopylae as one way that the Persians were able to kind of infiltrate the democracies, and tie a direct line to that in Russian election interference in 2016. So yes, it's true we are more open to outside interference. On the other hand, going back to the previous point, we are more resilient to it. I mean, we're so awash in information already. It's not clear that Russia's Facebook posts and things had a decisive influence on the election. On the other hand, it's harder to penetrate autocratic societies, but they are more brittle in this way. And in the 7 rivalries I look at, I think 5 of the 7 end in the autocratic system collapsing or having a regime change or a coup or civil war in one way or another. And so I do think that's a likely way that this ends, that Putinism or the CCP come to an end. And so while we're more open, our domestic systems are more open, they're more resilient, their systems are more fragile.
Thank you. And the next question is, what about China's and Russia's ownership of U.S. assets? Does that pose a possible problem?
It does. And, the United States has a system in place for reviewing foreign investments in the United States, the CFIUS process, Committee on the Foreign Investment in the United States. And so we've gotten better over the past few years of recognizing some of the Chinese investments that are worrying. And we've done a good job of identifying some of those and preventing them. There's more work to be done. But I think one of the areas where we can really improve here is by working with our allies. So many of our allies don't have similar rules on the books. And so I think working with them to identify what are the critical technology areas or national security areas where China is investing in your economy, and can we work with you to put laws on the books to make that impossible? Essentially, one of the ideas I've called for in some other work is a democratic technology alliance of leading democracies working together on some of these critical technology issues, and preventing Chinese investment in sensitive areas would be a part of that.
Thank you. And the next question is, do you think the fact that China's rise has led some to question whether their state-led development model is superior to an open economic system represents a global shift in soft power that the West needs to be concerned about?
Yes, and I was concerned about it, and it's part of the reason that I decided to write this book. That I think many people, including in the West, thought that maybe China has the better system. I think there's enormous evidence, social science research, 2,500 years of history to suggest no, they don't. And so I think getting that message out is important. And I did, the Biden administration has talked about the importance of democracy and seeing this competition through a democracy versus autocracy lens. And I think that is a helpful lens to view it through, and to go to countries in the developing world and say, really, which system do you think is better? Now, for many would-be autocrats, I can see how they'd like the Chinese system because it allows them to remain in power. But if they truly want their countries to be successful, to be wealthy, and to be powerful, I think the open market democratic model has shown itself to be quite successful throughout human history.
Thank you. And the next question is from a student in the Netherlands studying international relations. So her question is, how do you think the recent situation in the U.S. with people storming the Capitol and general skepticism in democracy affects the position of the U.S. as a global hegemon and the possible prevalence of the U.S. in these tensions with China and Russia?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for listening in. If you've read the book, you'll see I have this chapter on the Dutch Republic, which is really remarkable. I have a newfound appreciation for what the Dutch accomplished in the 1600s. And I know some of my friends at the Dutch Embassy in Washington have read my book and liked it. But the question is a good one. I think there's no question that the January 6th attacks tarnished the U.S. Image, led people to question the resilience of American democracy, led some of our own people to question, if we can't govern ourselves, what makes us think we can lead abroad, led some of our allies to question us. If we can't govern ourselves, why should we be leading an alliance of democracies abroad? And led our enemies to use this as a propaganda coup. Look at the United States, look how dysfunctional it is. So I think it did hurt the U.S. image, but I think we will recover. I think, we've had similar challenges in the past, more severe challenges, the Civil War, for example. And I think we've often come out stronger. And my hope is that will be the case here as well, that we'll get through this challenge and emerge from it in a stronger position.
Thank you. And due to the limited time, we'll just take 2 more questions. So the next question is, what do you think is the advantage and disadvantage of the state-run capitalism in China compared to the free market-based capitalism in the United States?
Well, China does have some advantages. When it comes to making big bets on technology, it can use the state to direct resources to certain areas. And it has done that in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic missiles, arguably has a lead, according to some measures, in those areas. So that's the advantage. The disadvantage is, how do they know they're making the right bets? In a market-based system, you let a number of different private actors pursue a number of different paths. One of them pays off, and you have major breakthroughs. The Chinese government is instead betting on these big state behemoths. And that often doesn't work. You're essentially making those big state behemoths less competitive and less efficient, because they know they can rely on state handouts. And you're essentially discriminating against other companies that might have a better model. And so, it's working in some areas for now, but I'm skeptical that this is a good model for long-run innovation.
Thank you. And the last question for today's event is it likely and possible that Xi Jinping and the CCP is following Sun Tzu's principles and teachings?
Sun Tzu, the classic Chinese strategist. Interesting question. Number of different ways I could take this. Trying to find a good way to wrap it up. I think Sun Tzu said, I think in a way they're not, and it's to their own disadvantage. Sun Tzu essentially thought deception was an important part of international politics. When you're strong, you want to appear weak. When you're weak, you want to appear strong. And I think Deng Xiaoping understood that with his hide your capabilities, bide your time maxim. China should keep its head down, grow powerful. But President Xi has thrown that out the window, bearing China's fangs, becoming more assertive and aggressive in many areas. And I think that's what's really leading to the world to begin to rally around against China. So maybe a new generation of Chinese leadership. I published a long strategy for how to deal with China at the Atlantic Council in December, called an allied strategy for China. And I essentially say I think this is going to be a generational-long struggle. I think it's going to be hard to convince President Xi and the people around him to take a different course. But that I think the hope is to show the next generation of Chinese leaders that President Xi's path hasn't worked. It's been too difficult, too costly to challenge the United States and its allies, and that it's in Beijing's best interest to, instead of challenging the United States and its allies, to try to cooperate as responsible members of a rules-based system.
Thank you, Dr. Kroenig, for taking so many interesting and important questions. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'd like to share our upcoming event on March 10th, next Wednesday, with IWP Professor Emeritus Kenneth E. D. Graffenried. He'll be presenting a lecture on 70 years of Chinese strategic intelligence threats. Again, thank you very much, and this concludes our event today.